Welcome to the Center for U.S. War Veterans Oral Histories at the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey in Seagirt, a partner of the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project. Today is February 19th, 2016. I am Carol Fowler, Director of the Center. Assisting me is Dean Medina from Rutgers University. Our honored veteran is Mark Otto, who served in the United States Marine Corps in both Operation Just Cause in Panama and Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf. He served from September 1988 until September 1992, active duty, and worked as a surveillance sensor operator, a radio operator, airborne, and a field wireman. Thank you for wanting to be here today, Mark. Your eyewitness account is considered a primary historical source and a valuable addition to the Veterans History Project here at the Militia Museum. Good morning, Mark, and welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. And we heard about you from Middletown, VFW?
That's right.
Okay, thanks. Angel Rodriguez, my Vietnam veteran interviewee.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Had anybody in your family served before you?
Yes. I'm actually fifth in my family to serve, not only in the military, but in war. So my grandfather fought in World War II. My great uncle fought in World War II. My father did 3 tours in Vietnam, and my uncle did 2 tours in Vietnam. They were all in the Army, though, so I used to get teased around Thanksgiving.
Oh, okay. What do they say?
Oh, there's always the rivalry between the Army and the Marine Corps, so, you know, little funny remarks here and there.
Marines used to steal stuff or from each other?
Which unit, you know, which branch of service is tougher and that type of thing. So,
oh, I see.
All the branches are like that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
That's true.
I've heard them all.
But other than that, did they speak to you about what combat was like as you grew up?
Not so much. When my grandfather died while I was pretty young, I never met my great uncle. He passed away when I was young as well. So I did meet my uncle who fought 2 tours in Vietnam. He was an MP. My father, he was in ordnance. So he never spoke much about it, but you know, there is a big story about my father and my mom. So my dad served in Vietnam 3 tours. He was in 65 through the end of 68. So my dad was in ordnance. He met my mom his first tour. They got married, had my sister in Vietnam. The second tour, they had me. And then at the end of the second tour was the Tet Offensive. So my mom had come from a farming family from the southwestern part of Vietnam, bordering Cambodia. So they actually used to bring produce in by Saigon. That's where I met my father. So at the end of the second tour was the Tet Offensive, and there was chaos and pandemonium everywhere going on. People were getting killed and murdered in the streets. They were separated, and there were no street signs or easy ways to get in touch with people. So my mom went into hiding. Again, she had my wife. I mean, my sister was very young, and she was pregnant with me. So my father couldn't find her, and the end of his tour was up. So he was actually sent back to the United States, unable to find her. He gets back to the United States. My dad's one of 11 from a big German-Irish family. They grew up in the village of New York City, Thompson, between Houston and Prince. So back then it wasn't the Soho that it is now. But back then, you know, with a tight-knit family, they told him, you absolutely cannot go back there to find her. People are getting murdered in the streets. The Tet Offensive is going on. It's just chaos. So my dad, on his own, just said, I'm going. I have to find out what happened to them. So my dad signed on for a 3rd tour in the Vietnam War and flew back to find him. He landed at an airport in Saigon. They started driving in a Jeep to get him back to the base, and the Jeep in front of them blew up. The 2 people in the front were killed, and my dad was in the back. He wakes up in a hospital in Saigon, and a colonel was walking down the road handing out Purple Hearts. And my father goes, I was in a car accident. I don't deserve a Purple Heart. So he didn't know all the details that he found out later. From there, once he found out where he was, he didn't even check out of the hospital. He just got up and walked out of the hospital. So he was pretty banged up. His head was all bandaged up. He ended up getting something like 30-something stitches in his head because of the accident. But other than that, he was just badly bruised and sort of beaten up. he starts walking towards where he knew the marketplace was, where my mom might be. So again, everywhere was just chaos and pandemonium. There was just destruction everywhere. So he ends up finding another GI that he knew that drove him in a Jeep, picked him up after walking for a couple miles, and they start driving around the marketplace. And by chance, he finds my grandfather. So my grandfather didn't recognize him because his head was all bandaged up. So my dad actually had to take off the bandages and show him who he was. So fortunately, he makes it through the third tour. So my dad was one of 11. My mom was one of 7. So they just sort of assumed that my dad and my mom were going to live happily ever after in Vietnam. So the end of that tour, my mom applies for a visa to go back to the United States. But once again, my dad's tour ends before the visa's done. So my dad has to go back to the United States, back to New York City, and wait for my mom. So my grandfather at that time, obviously my dad had earned his trust. He helps my mom fill out the paperwork, puts her on a plane to the airport, sends her off to the United States, and has to go back and tell her brothers and sisters that they may never see her again.
Oh.
So.
Or the baby, the girl,
yeah.
and the baby, you.
Yeah. So fortunately, that we ended up coming back. Since then, my mom and dad ended up helping my mother. Her sister, her youngest sister, actually wanted to come across and escape Vietnam in the 70s. So I don't know if you heard about the boat people back then. So they were part of that, and my parents ended up making connections in Vietnam, into Cambodia, into Thailand, into Europe, and then eventually getting them across here to the United States. So my mom's sister, her husband, and 6 children ended up coming across. It's a happy ending, though. Every one of them owns their own businesses, and they've all prospered really well here in the United States. So really, it was just my dad that talked about it. Everyone else, I was either too young, or I saw my uncle too infrequently to actually bring it up when I was in the military.
But do you know from others what your grandfather's story was?
I know my grandfather was an MP. I know he was in the 3rd Army, so I guess he technically served under Patton in World War II. Other than that, I don't really know the details. Mm-hmm. I do know that he actually was drafted and then went back. So he had broken service, but he actually went back in World War II on his own.
Interesting.
Yeah. I know that my great uncle was awarded the Bronze Star Medal. So the only way we knew about that was my family's funeral plot on my father's side is in Queens. And when someone passed away, they were looking through the tombstones for the family, and they found my uncle. And on his tombstone, it actually said VSM Service Army and the dates. And Bronze Star Medal is what we all just, connected it with.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Something out of a movie.
Yeah. We have a movie star in our midst.
Really, it was my dad.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is he still alive?
Yes. So my parents, I'm from Westfield, New Jersey originally. So they were in that area for many years. They just moved down to West Palm Beach. So they're very happy to get rid of the winter.
Oh,
That's lucky though.
Yeah.
How did you come to be in the service? You had been in high school, and then you went right in. You enlisted?
Yes. So ever since I was little, I always wanted to serve our country and be in the military. So it was at a very young age that I knew that I was going to go in. So in high school, I was sort of a hellraiser, never getting into trouble, but always partying, having a good time. So I really didn't have any direction in life. And I always thought in the back of my mind, this is really what I want to do. So that's where my focus was. So I was always an underachiever in high school. That all really changed. Much of my life changed after what I learned in the military. So I definitely am better for it.
Why the Marine Corps?
To tell you honestly, I wanted to actually join the Army first. So I wanted to get into Special Forces. So back then, though, 25 years ago, you had to already be a sergeant to try out. So that sort of meant that you already had to have 4 years in before you even tried out. So I wasn't sure I wanted to make a career of it. And, you know, I knew that I definitely wanted to do at least the 4 years and then figure it out from there. So I learned through friends of mine in high school and people I had contact with from the Marine Corps that there were other units out there that you didn't have to actually wait so long and that you could try out for, you know, early on and do it in a 4-year period. So that's ultimately why I tried the Marine Corps, and you know, I'm definitely happy with the results. So.
Great. So the first place I'm guessing was Parris Island?
Yeah. So I was a 3rd Battalion India Company, Parris Island.
What kind of adjustment was it for you?
Honestly, it wasn't that difficult. I mean, I was really physically prepared for it at the time. Some of the people that sort of gave me notes on what to expect and how to prepare myself were former snipers and former recon types. So they sort of knew the path I wanted to go down. So I was already devoting a lot of my time and efforts towards preparing myself. So for the next step after boot camp. So I was in really good physical shape at that point in time. I was a runner, a swimmer, so that part really wasn't that hard. I did find, you know, boot camp could wear on you after a while. You know, the redundancy, the abuse that goes on, you sort of get used to it, but
mental abuse?
Yeah, but for 13 weeks, really, it's not until the late phase that you realize, wow, we've been here a long time doing this. And the finish line is still way off because, you know, I think the Navy is like 6 weeks in boot camp. I don't know what the Air Force is. I think it might be even less. The Army's 8 weeks, but the Marine Corps is 13 weeks. So, you know, it's just the time after a while starts to wear down on you. However, you know, I would, through most of the time I was in boot camp on Parris Island, there's basically 4 billets that you could be in for leadership. So you could be a squad leader, or you could be the guide. So I spent most of the time on Parris Island either as a squad leader or carrying the flag as the guide. So that was something I was really proud of.
Interesting.
Would you say that you lost track of time during your training?
Absolutely, yeah. After a while, you just realize that it's going to be a long time, and time doesn't really matter anymore.
You're in it for the long haul.
Exactly. So, but in my mind, I was already looking past boot camp and thinking about, you know, when I get out of here, I have to continue with training and move on to the next phase.
Which was Camp Lejeune?
So from there, I was assigned to 8th Com Battalion on Camp Lejeune, and
Com is command?
Communications Battalion.
Oh, that's what I thought at
yeah,
first. Okay.
so my initial MOS when I entered was 2512, which was field wireman. So field wireman.
Right.
So yeah, it was pretty antiquated. And you think about like the old World War II movies where they have these phone lines that people are literally running with spools. And,
yes.
And if you're calling for fire or stuff, you use these types of phones, and that's how they strung the command centers together and communicated with each other was these manual labor field wiremen like running phone lines. So I wasn't there for long when I was at 8th Com. From there, I actually tried out for 2nd Force Recon. At that point, anybody in the Corps who wanted to try out could try out for Force Recon. So it didn't matter what your billet was. You could be an administrator at a desk, but if you thought you had what it takes, you could try out. So I tried out, and then I was assigned. It's a one-day process. You go in, you get screened. The company commander has an interview with you, but it's just a grueling day where they just beat you down. It starts in the morning when the sun comes up, and it ends when it's very dark. So it's just a mental test and a physical test to see if you have what it takes to be in the command.
What was that interview like?
The interview with the company commander, it was pretty tense. I mean, it was very short. He basically, you know, asked why I joined the Corps, and ultimately I told him, well, this is it. This is why I'm here. And one of the funny things about the interview is the actual command name is 2nd Force Reconnaissance Company. So you'd be surprised. He asked off the bat, spell reconnaissance for me. And for those of you who have never spelled the word reconnaissance, RECONNAISSANCE, it's a pretty long word. I think some of the smarter people may have just said RECON.
Wow. I read that the Force Recon companies, also known as Force Recon, are one of the Marine Corps' special ops capable forces that provide essential elements of military intelligence to the command element of the Marine Air Ground Task Force, supporting their task force commanders and their subordinate operating units of the Fleet Marine Force.
That's absolutely correct. But you have to also understand the company has a command structure, so they also had administrative, logistics people, communications sector, people that run the boat locker, that actually drive the boats, whatever it is. So I was actually assigned to the communications division. So I was in the comm department within 2nd Force Recon while I was there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So from there, I picked up the new billet. My new MOS was 2531, so that's radio operator. So at that point in time, it was a great place to be because of in the comm shop, you're a critical part of the unit. A lot of the times for training or ops, they actually pull communicators in to actually work in the field and help with the operations. Back in that point in time, Little Creek, Virginia, where they're sending most of the people for actual recon school, where you get the next billet. However, we actually, at that point in time, were doing a lot of that training in-house on Camp Lejeune.
Okay.
Part of the problem that they were finding was when they were sending troops through Little Creek, Virginia, they weren't retaining what they were learning because they were working on no sleep for long durations of time, and they'd come back and you almost like forget what you learned. So the in-house training they had done for a while, and it was great to actually be a part of that training because you're actually setting up comms and being a part of that whole process.
How long were you at Camp Lejeune?
Camp Lejeune was my home base the entire 4 years I was in the Corps. So I moved around from 2nd Force Recon. I actually then went on to intelligence company. So something occurred in the late 80s, early 90s that was sort of unique. The Marine Corps decided to say, okay, we're going to stand up surveillance, reconnaissance, and intelligence groups at each division. So on Camp Pendleton at the 1st Marines, Camp Lejeune 2nd, and then Okinawa was the 3rd. So each one of them had their own surveillance, reconnaissance, and intelligence group. So everyone always thinks that the Fleet Marine Corps force and then division level and everything's sort of infantry orientated. So the SRI groups were actually tasked with consolidating all of the assets that had to do with intelligence, whether you're a recon unit and you're gathering intelligence, or you're intelligence analysts, or whatever you're doing. All of the intel assets were under this envelope of the 2nd SRI group. So when I was at Camp Lejeune, I just moved around within that command. So 8th Com was part of that command, 2nd Force Recon was part of that command, and then after 2nd Force Recon, they were actually redoing or revamping this sensor surveillance unit at Intelligence Company. So I was assigned to Intelligence Company along with several people that were staff NCOs from 2nd Force Recon to conduct training and revamp this intelligence unit. So I actually ended up getting reassigned to the intelligence unit. And that's where I spent the bulk of my time.
I read that remote sensors ops is placing remote sensors and beacons. They're vital for marking the friendly hostile boundaries and areas for helicopter pilots for assault or infantry transport, becoming detrimental for combat or logistic support. This mission has made pathfinding obsolete.
Yes, I think that the general gist of it is with sensors, you can use them for any variety of things. So if you want to set up a perimeter and you draw literally a line with these tactical remote sensor strings and you lay out 20 of them, there are all different types of sensors. There are ones that pick up certain types of metals that are only found in like the eyelids of boots and that type of thing. There are other sensors that pick up vibrations in the ground. There are other sensors that you shoot an infrared beam where if you cut it from left to right, you'll know which direction people are moving. Still more, there are ones that are air delivered. So in Desert Storm, we were shooting from A6 intruders, bombers, into the ground and tracking enemy movement. So, but you're right. You could use them actually to call for fire as well. So we use them in all different aspects. But it really was how creative you were as far as the usage. A lot of the people for the sensor surveillance units had comm backgrounds. The way that sensors work, back then, we're talking 25 years ago, they're pretty complex technology. So you would lay out sensor strings wherever you were, and if you needed to, you would also have to ping the signals off repeaters and then go back to a site. At the site, someone would be on a monitor, and the monitor would simply know where these sensors were plotted on grid, and they'd all be assigned a number. So if sensor number 5 went off on your string, you know the exact location. So these types of things were critical, particularly during combat operations.
Can you describe how you yourself worked in that kind of field, maybe like a typical day?
Sure. Well, the training, when we revamped our unit at 2nd Intelligence Company, our commander, David Colvin, actually came over from Joint Special Operations Command. The staff NCOs were for the most part, all from 2nd Force Recon. So they took all these, there was some infantry, but a lot of us were radio operators and retrained us. And ultimately, we received the same type of training as the Force Recon teams were actually utilizing. So we broke up into 5-man teams. And these 5-man teams, we would actually be sent out on missions. So a lot of the times you send 2 teams out at a time, and because for monitoring purposes, you just flip-flop. One team would work X amount of hours and monitor, and the other team would do the active patrolling. So once you had the sensor strings out, a lot of the times you're patrolling on activations depending on what you had to do. You also had to replace batteries after a certain duration of time. So they were lithium batteries. Depending on where we were in Panama, we actually were sending teams down there for years and using these sensor strings along critical parts. Like Panama is pretty much triple canopy jungle once you get outside the city limits. So like the Arahan tank farm is actually that's one place where they were worried that people were actually going to jump the fence line because they're easily covered by jungle. So you put these sensor strings around the perimeter, and then you know if you had a breach. So that's one example. Later on, when the Panama Vision kicked off, we used these sensor strings on critical pathways that led to and from the city, and that way we could keep an eye on the Panamanian Defense Forces that worked for Noriega at that time. So you can use them for anti-infiltration type things. But typically speaking, when we're at the base and we're in garrison and there's not a war going on, our workups, we basically live in the field. So, out of a 7-day work week, it's very often you're out in the field living out there for 5 days. So we never use tents. It's much like a reconnaissance unit. You traveled light, you only carried what you had to. A lot of the times for training purposes, though, they like to build up the loads that we were carrying just to build up our endurance. So I think the heaviest load I carried in Desert Storm was about 120 pounds. But for training purposes on Lejeune, it was at least usually between 50, 75 pounds was pretty typical. However, your skill craft and your field craft was really built up by being out in the field all the time. So small patrol, 5-man teams, your responsibilities are really increased tenfold because you're not a large infantry unit and you're moving with 40 guys or more. You're moving with 5 people. So there was a lot of cross training. We all had more enhanced medical training as far as if someone got hit. So everyone learned comms, even if you were an infantry person, because that was critical as well. Everyone had to be able to call an airstrike, call medevac, call an intel, SIP reps, that type of thing, situation reports. Mm-hmm. So we were all cross-trained to do each other's jobs. So in the Panama Vision, I was a radio operator and I was a team member. Desert Storm, pretty much the same thing, but I was actually also additionally an assistant patrol leader. So the chain of command, even at a 5-person level, is the same. So you always have a patrol leader, an assistant patrol leader, and then the other people have their functions on the team. So radio operator, or your rifleman on more of the execution side of security for the patrol. So, in Desert Storm, I was assistant patrol leader. After that, we ended up doing counter-narcotics operations on the border of Mexico and the U.S. borders. So when we started doing surveillance down there, I did one operation. I was a team leader. I did another operation behind that, and I was there as sort of an advisor.
And someone wrote a letter after you did that. Was it Chief Warrant Officer Colvin, or was it Group Supervisor Thomas Gill?
So David Colvin, he was actually my platoon commander for pretty much the entire time I was in. So he commanded me in the Panama Vision, Desert Storm, and both counter-narcotics operations. It's probably his background that had a lot to do with how many assignments we were actually getting on, because I think that if we weren't the first Marine Corps unit sent down to do the counter-narcotics operations, we were one of them. I think we were the first, though. So Thomas Gill was actually, he was the head agent in charge for the Customs Office of Enforcement down there. So things got a bit more complex when we were working those types of operations. It was a joint task force. So the Tri-County Task Force was down there. We had the Sheriff's Department. We had Texas Rangers down there, U.S. Border Patrol, DEA. So all of these federal agencies had to coordinate, and we were one of them that was actually sent from the military side. So as far as doing that type of operation, those are long hair ops, no uniforms. We were our own sort of satellite command, and we reported back basically through a fax machine. But
When was this?
so that was 1992. So both operations. So yeah, that was a much different type of usage as far as the sensor surveillance.
It was called CounterDrug.
Counter-narcotics.
And where exactly did you go?
At that point, the first operation we did was in a small town called Presidio, Texas. So I believe the population was like 2,000. It sat on the Rio Grande River, and across from us was Onaga. And so I believe the population of that was in the hundreds of thousands.
Wow.
So other than that, where it is on a map, if you take all those nicely populated places in Texas, like Austin, Houston, San Antonio, and you take, I believe it's Highway 10, which goes all the way out west towards El Paso. If you drop down like 3/4 of the way to El Paso, down on the border, it's basically, if you looked up the middle of nowhere, that's it. So the entire drive down is just like all desert or ranches, and all you see for many miles is just ranch fences with barbed wires, which is basically, don't come on my land.
Did it remind you of desert you had seen in war?
Not so much. In Desert Storm, it was just more like shifting sand dunes. Out here, there was definite like physical structures, so it was more brown foliage, also a lot of rocky formations and cliffs and that type of thing. So it was a different type of a desert, and it was pretty wide open. Typically speaking, you'd stand out there and you'd see a lot of sandstorms, but you would see also like thunderstorms rolling across the plain. Wow. And these clouds are like miles high with lightning in them, and you just saw it coming. It was typical to see that type of thing.
So you got this beautiful letter from Chief Colvin. It says that Mark Otto is a frank, energetic, non-commissioned officer, superb leader who can be counted on to accomplish all missions, both combat and training, without supervision. His combat record during Operation Just Cause Panama and Operation Desert Shield Storm is beyond reproach. During combat operations, Corporal Otto led 5-man sensor reconnaissance teams, gathering intelligence on enemy movement. He served on numerous real-world counter-narcotics operations, supporting federal law enforcement agencies in combating the war on drugs. These operations were highly successful. Corporal Otto received extensive special operations training, including instinctive shooting packages, Recon team leader, sensor surveillance, fast rope, and anti-terrorist training covering terrorist operations, hostage survival, counter-surveillance, and individual protective measures. A can-do attitude coupled with a well-rounded background is Corporal Otto's greatest quality. Mark Otto's leadership and technical expertise would make him a valued asset to any organization. Corporal Otto is among the best Marine non-commissioned officer I've seen in almost 20 years of service, and a natural in high-risk situations. And then he says how he can be contacted. That's incredible. Congratulations.
Thanks. I know you've had an interest in special forces since you were, little. That's how you got into becoming Force Recon, but did you have a particular interest in communications or talent for it? Like, how did you become selected for a radio operator?
That's a good question. So when I was sort of being advised before I got in the military as to what I should do, I was sort of advised to look at either comm or medic. So the only problem is in the Army they do train medics, in the Marine Corps they do not. So if you are in a ground combat orientated theater or that's your MOS field, we borrow from the Navy and we use their corpsmen, even on the recon teams. So that was sort of a path that was shut off when I said, okay, I'm not going to go for Army, I'm going to go for the Marines. So I thought, who's critical on a patrol team like that? So in my mind, I think being a communicator is probably the most critical next to being a team leader or the medic. The comms, you're responsible for everything. You send in situation reports, medevacs, call for fire missions, any type of support comes through communication. So I thought it was a better asset to have as far as, as MOSs are concerned.
Good.
I agree with your opinion on that too.
So can you talk about that counter-narcotics work that you did? I mean, can you talk about what became of it, how successful it was? Are you allowed to talk about it?
I can't go really too much into depth. What I can tell you is, again, being creative on how you use sensors. That was a perfect example. I mean, some of the benefits that we had, even today, covering the U.S. border with Mexico is almost an impossibility unless they build a wall. And even at that, they're probably going to just tunnel under it. But I think that the sensors are certainly beneficial because you could cover large spaces of land and not have to have the manpower out there. So the great thing about a sensor is they don't get tired. They're out there transmitting all the time. Depending on what type of sensor strings you have, you can get an incredible amount of data as far as direction, how many people are moving along that string. And you can gather that intelligence and pass it on to whoever needs to have it. So that's where the Joint Task Force came into play. So a lot of it, we were an intelligence gathering asset. Because of the Posse Comitatus Acts, we as the military aren't allowed to arrest people. So a lot of the times if there was a reactionary force, we could only go in support of the federal agents. If they were shot at, and then we could engage. So those were the roles.
Oh, okay. Did that happen?
I can't go into stuff like that.
Sounds like it did happen. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I can't confirm or deny it.
Think whatever you want to think, right?
Right. But yes, the operations were very successful.
That's good. So you set up your sensors and then you go into an office and you look at them on a computer? Yes.
So the signals are transmitted. We pinged them off the mountains because it was actually pretty mountainous around the river in that area. So to amplify the signals, we used the remote pingers, and then back in the monitoring site, someone would actually watch on, see if you call it a computer 20 something years ago.
Oh, okay.
You're right.
That's right.
But it was a monitor, and they could tell exactly what sensors are going off where, and piece together, amount of enemy and movement and direction, that type of thing.
Was that you that would sit with the monitor, or you were always in the field, you said, right?
So, like I said, a lot of the times we ended up having two teams out there and we just flip-flop
okay.
to give people rest. So, either you're out there doing the operations or your team had monitoring, and you just break it up into, 6-hour increments, whatever it was.
And you were also in Virginia Beach?
Yes. So that was for training. So, Navy Marine Corps Intelligence Training Center is where they sent us to learn about sensors. So it was a school on the technology. So back then it was pretty technical. You also had advanced mapping. So a lot of what we did as far as going out in 5-man teams, you had to really understand topographical maps and how to navigate. So that also was true as far as plotting strings and understanding the landscape, because a lot of the times, understanding the landscape is going to make it so that you have less repeaters that you have to put up. So if you can strategically put the sensors in an area that's open, you can get a good transmitted signal. You could actually avoid having to put up a pinger as far as relaying a signal back.
Okay. Let's go to Panama. I know we've been jumping around.
Yeah.
I read that the Marines made up only a small percentage of the forces that went into battle during Operation Just Cause in December 1989. But for a period of more than 2 years, the Marines in Panama were literally in foxholes on the front lines. Was that you?
I wasn't so much in the foxhole. When we got down to Panama, we were actually rotating out another team that was already down there. We've been sending teams down there for a while. There's fixed bases down there. We flew into Rodman Naval Station, and that's where I was stationed. So December, I want to say it was December 18th, if I'm remembering correctly, was the incident that actually sparked the Panama invasion. So little known thing about Panama. Back then, Noriega was one of the only people that actually declared war on the United States. So if you look it up, Panama is actually a war. Anyway, as far as the history and the knowledge of Panama before us, apparently Noriega was put in place in the early 70s. He was on the CIA payroll. He was then put in power down there. And as far as I knew just from the history,
83. He became head of the National Guard.
Right.
And he combined it with the Air Force and Navy to create Panamanian Defense Forces, which you mentioned earlier.
Right. So as far as Panama, I mean, obviously it's a strategic location just because of the canal. The other things that were going on is, as far as the history books are concerned, is that there was a lot of operations that were going north and south of Panama that were using Panama as a staging area.
Costa Rica and Colombia?
Honduras and those types of places.
Oh.
So we ended up rotating a team down there. I flew down there, I believe it was the 21st. So if I remember correctly, the incident, I believe it was on the 18th. He declared war on the United States, basically shut down Panama City and started putting his Panamanian Defense Forces up with barricades. So because we had U.S. bases down there, there was a curfew. But apparently, I believe the story goes that there were a few officers out in town. One of them was Navy, I believe, and the other two were Marines. And they were confronted at a barricade and tried to drive away. One of them was shot and killed.
Oh.
And that was sort of the trigger that occurred and sparked the Panama invasion.
President Bush the first was in charge.
So most people, the funny thing is nowadays, I have a lot of high contact with the military and the newer generation. I've actually met people and said, when they said, "Where'd you serve?" And I told them, "Oh, Panama invasion and Desert Storm." I've actually had somebody say, "We invaded Panama." Mm-hmm. So anyways, fast forward, when we got down there, it was routine. We were in civilian clothing on a civilian airliner. We get out. And we get approached and they say, "Are you guys from 2nd SRI group?" And yes, we were. And they said, "Wait here." And a 5-ton troop carrier came around from the back of the plane, dropped the gates, and they said, "Go get your weapons." We were still in civilian clothing.
Oh, okay.
So this was basically the run-up to the invasion.
Which showed how urgent it was, right?
Exactly. So we were armed in civilian clothing heading back to Rodman Naval Station from the airstrip. From there, they had some snipers that brought us out that had been on the ground for a while that knew all the pertinent locations. So we did a drive around, figured out, what were going to be the key locations. At that point in time, though, protocol had it that when you're replacing a team, the prior team takes out all the sensors out of the ground. So we had no sensors in the ground at that point in time.
Starting from scratch.
So
What's the point of that? For you to-
because your new team should put out their fresh strings.
Oh, okay.
So they'll know exactly where they're plotted, what you're using.
Oh, okay.
Also, you're going to replace all the batteries, everything's fresh.
I see.
So at that point in time, there were no sensors in the ground. So that turned into the old saying that every Marine's a rifleman. So at that point in time, our teams were split up, and the people that we were replacing that were